Welcome to Consciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome once again to Consciousness. I am your host, David Rothkopf, and this week, as every week, we will be doing a deep dive into an aspect of AI we think you ought to know about. This week, we are extremely fortunate to be joined by Sean Williams. Sean is the founder and CEO of AutogenAI. That's a UK startup that uses AI and cutting-edge language technology to help clients in North America, Europe, and the Middle East craft high-impact proposals for public and private sector contracts. With a background in leading large-scale public service operations and managing contracts, Sean is passionate about AI, the future of work, business innovation, and unlocking human potential through technology. And those are the things we're passionate about. So we're very glad to have you here today. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks, David. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the role that your company plays. I've read about it. It talks about how it uses generative AI. Of course, toothpaste today apparently uses generative AI. Everybody mentions that, so you may want to back that up a little bit. But more broadly, this seems like an example of what we've talked about on some recent shows about agentic AI that can actually take a small company and make it perform like a big company, a small group of people, and enable them to do much more than they could have in the past. And so as people listen, I wouldn't limit their thoughts simply to, a tool that can help write a proposal, but to a whole class of technologies that can help open up new kinds of productivity.
Yeah, look, David, thank you. I think there's a lot of nonsense spoken about AI. I tend to agree. I moved to the States 6 months ago, and I went to the store to buy a toothbrush, and it was an AI-powered toothbrush. Now, I'm not entirely sure.
I was just joking around. I didn't know that was actually out there.
No. So people are putting this writing on everything now. So look, there's lots of different forms of artificial intelligence. I particularly want to talk about generative artificial intelligence because it's where I have some expertise, and particularly then generative artificial intelligence with language. And so the way I put this, and I come from a humanities background as much as a technical background, is that computers can read and write. And 5 years ago, computers couldn't read and write. We were really used to them being able to add up and multiply faster than us, but they couldn't read and write. They weren't bad at it. They were utterly hopeless at it. And then with the attention is all you need paper in 2017, and then as the models got bigger and trained on more data, you got this emergent property of computers being able to do language, of being able to read and write. Now, that is profound. That is so different to anything that we've ever seen before. And computers can't read and write as well as we can yet. Maybe they never will be able to. But they can read and write orders of magnitude faster than we can, like massively quicker. So any human activity, in business, in life, in society, that involves reading or writing is going to be transformed by this new technology that speeds that up so many times. So, look, I'm not going to go through I couldn't possibly go through every human activity that involves reading and writing, but you can think of a lot of jobs, a lot of activities that do. But the area I particularly decided to focus on when I first came across this technology in early 2020, the area which really kind of I understood was proposal writing, because my very first job coming out of university was as a proposal writer. So I knew about the $500 billion that is spent globally by people writing responses to written buying exercises. You know, when the US government wants to buy the next generation of fighter plane, they do it based on who's written the best proposal and the best price, of course, but actually a large part is evaluating the written words that have been submitted by companies. So this was an area I understood. It's obviously an area that involves a great deal of reading and writing. So something this new technology could be applied to. That's everything from reading RFP documentation to reading what a general has said about how they want the plane to operate, to kind of reading the latest science papers in this area, and then of course writing, taking that information, answering the questions at hand, and telling your organisation's story narrative based on your experiences, case studies, statistics, etc. So really, this was a problem set which was built for both the strengths and weaknesses of large language models. But to your wider point, I often say that we do something quite boring with a magical technology. This technology is going to change everything that involves reading and writing.
So as one can imagine building a tool like this, being able to master reading and writing is important. But then what you have it read and what you have it write is the magic that you're referring to. And specifically, I can imagine in a lot of these cases, it requires not just a large language model mastery of how to sort through some data and structure a sentence, but it really requires kind of level of technical sophistication, but also an understanding of what the proposal reader is looking for. How do you imbue something like this with that?
Yeah, it's. I often say we read as much Cicero at AutogenAI as we read Turing. This isn't a new topic. How do you persuade people? How do you do rhetoric? We've been talking about this actually for thousands of years. So of course, there are specific elements of proposals, which is very structured. Often there are published scoring criteria, so you want to meet those scoring criteria. But actually, if you go back to Cicero's Pillars of Rhetoric and you start to say, okay, well, how's the structure? What's the narrative structure look like? How is evidence being deployed? How is the use of persuasive language, mirroring language? Of course, the first point of any rhetoric is understand who the audience is and what it is that they want to hear. So actually, there's a vast body of literature, both from right from ancient Greece and the Romans, and so kind of classical literature, right up to modern psychology, neuroscience of persuasion, and everything in between. So really, it's pulling on these enormously multidisciplinary areas. Obviously, the first people to build large language models and explore large language models were primarily astrophysicists, physicists, and mathematicians, because they were the people who really understood the maths behind creating the transformer architecture and the building of the neural nets. But the people who really understand how to use the tools, that use this power of being able to read and write and do it in exactly the sort of format that you are talking about. Well, don't get me wrong, you still need the mathematicians, you still need the data scientists, you still need the physicists. But you also, if you really want to understand what makes a persuasive argument, you want English literature majors. If you really want to understand what creates compelling evidence and which evidence is most persuasive and which evidence is actually best, then you want historians. If you want to really understand, we talk a lot about large language models hallucinating. Hallucinating means not telling the truth. If you want to say, how do you stop things not telling the truth, you need to come up with some sort of decent definition of what truth is. The people who've asked what truth is are philosophers over the years. So you need this enormously broad interdisciplinary teams to solve some of the problems that you're talking about, because they're not just technical problems, they're language problems.
But presumably you also, if you're doing a proposal for the Defense Department, you need somebody who understands what kernel X tends to look for, right?
Absolutely, and that's part of what we do in our software, for example, would be to upload kernel X's speeches, to read what kernel X has written in journals, to take obviously then intelligence from other sources around kernel X, and then use that to craft win themes, to craft narrative structures, to pull case studies, to design a solution that particularly meets those interests and nuances of kernel X's particular personality.
Well, so one of the things that it strikes me is a challenge here is that with examples of agentic AI, the power of the AI product is important. Quality of the structuring and design of that is important. But the ability of the principle to use the agent is also important, and I would imagine requires a degree of training. You talk about hallucinations, which is a term I'm a little averse to, simply because it implies kind of thought processes that are more brain-like than they really are. But it's an issue. Knowing what's true or not is an issue. Knowing where to accept the help of the agent or not is an issue. How big a challenge for a company like yours is the training and evolution of the people who are intended to be your prime users?
Yeah, training is huge for us. So we talk a lot about SWAS rather than SaaS. So software with a service rather than software as a service. All of the best organizations I speak to in the generative AI space are spending a massive amount of resources, time and effort on the people change management piece as much as on the build of products and really understanding the latest tech developments. So when we go into an organization, we'll be working with proposal teams of scores, perhaps hundreds of writers. They've been working in some cases for decades in a particular system, in a particular way. Writers are very used to doing things the way that they've done them in the past. So, AI is a tool. Our AutogenAI software is a tool, and tools can be extremely powerful, but generally the more powerful the tool, the more you need an educated user to know how to use that tool. There's no point having a sophisticated earth digger to dig you holes if you can't turn it on, kind of. And so AI we sometimes put into a different category than all other human tools, which is a mistake. AI is a tool for humans like other human tools are, and a tool, of course, can be powerful in and of itself, and it can be easier or harder to use, but tools need to be wielded by humans, and they need to be wielded for human ends. So the human in the loop, the training of the human, the skill of the human is, of course, as important as the power of it. In fact, it is impossible to separate from the power of the tool. The power of the tool and the skill of the human using it are completely symbiotic.
So, you clearly, you started out doing proposal writing and, are now, working hard to ensure that you've lost that job forever. But in so doing, you've created one for yourself. And, one of the big questions in AI is the trade-off between jobs lost and jobs gained. And in this case, it seems to cut to another aspect of AI, which I don't think is well understood, but I also think there's a kind of a lot of bullshit swirling around it. And that is whether AI is a leveler that helps the little guy do more, or whether it is a tool that helps the big rich guy keep is boot on the throat of the little guy. I'm oversimplifying it, but in this particular case, it does seem like, last week we had a entrepreneur and investor on who talked about something he called, and I may get the terminology wrong, but essentially the 3-person unicorn. In other words, little companies that use AI to do what big companies once did and to grow. And it seems to me you are really giving the little guy a leg up here. Is that your view, or am I misrepresenting this?
No, that's super important to us. Look, so I think you've touched on 2 really important issues there, and I actually want to pick. So again, the right way of thinking about these problems is to think of analogies from history, because although this technology is new technologies in general are not new. We have new technologies all the time. And actually, the piece I would point to, we often describe ourselves as the Excel for competitive writing. And if you go back to the advent of spreadsheets and the popularization of spreadsheets, it would have been a perfectly reasonable intellectual position to hold. In fact, I think it would have been the majority intellectual position to hold when you first saw spreadsheets to go, goodness, a lot fewer people are going to work in finance. There's going to be a lot of redundancies in finance post the introduction of spreadsheets, because we won't need people to add up all those columns of numbers anymore. And of course, people don't add up columns of numbers anymore. There aren't armies of people employed in that position anymore. But the number of people working in finance is massively more post spreadsheets than it was pre spreadsheets. Human societies are dynamic and they're complex. What happened with spreadsheets, what happened with Excel, which obviously won the kind of spreadsheet wars, was that it pushed humans up the cognitive hierarchy. It actually made organizations, and again, to come back to the specific point around the little guys and the big guys, it allowed the little guys to do the sort of sophisticated financial planning and analysis that otherwise was the purview only of big companies that could employ people to add up vast columns of numbers. So we see AI in much the same way. Of course, it will destroy some low-value jobs, but what it will really do is push humans up the cognitive hierarchy. As humans are pushed up the cognitive hierarchy, that creates higher-level work. It actually creates more work. It creates more thinking. It creates more analysis. And that really has been the history of all technologies throughout human existence. And then to the point specifically then around... apologies. The point specifically around kind of the big guy and the little guy. Yeah, big companies employ hundreds of proposal writers to enable them to get their messaging across to governments, to other businesses in the best possible way. Our software is a huge leveler for that. It allows you to do that efficiently, effectively, at scale, but you don't need to have then hundreds of people. You don't need to have a knowledge management system. You don't need to have all of those things we now become essentially with that single source of software. We also, because we take that so seriously, we have different pricing models depending on the size of a company. So we want to work in a sustainable way. And if we would just get the big guys to win more, they already win kind of an outsized level, for example, of government work, then government wouldn't want us around very much. So we have a pricing model which says, look, if you're a small, sort of 2-3 person company, then you pay a lot less than if you were a big kind of global giant. It's because we're keeping competition fair and keeping it open is extremely important.
And to what extent do you think the big guy is going to say, well, okay, I've got more money. I can have more data. I can get more more context into the competition here. I can, how do they add value? How does it change the competitive landscape? Or it may not be just small to big. There may be other criteria.
Yeah, I think that procurement becomes more efficient. I think that to a large extent, if you can tell your story best, that gives you an advantage over people who are less articulate in telling their story. I think this becomes a leveler. It allows all organizations to be very articulate in telling their story. And that means that more of the differentiation is coming down to who's actually delivering the best service, who's doing it at the best value for money, who's delivering the best value to the taxpayer. So I think it makes competition more efficient, which I think is a great thing for public services and indeed for business to business procurement.
Okay, so you're running an AI company that's out there. It's got a thing. It's the hottest area in the world. Presumably, every 20 minutes or so, some investment bank calls you up and says, "Oh yeah, let's buy this. I'd like to make you a billionaire." Because I mean, I read the newspaper. That's what's happening with AI. Is it's an extremely exciting world out there. Uh, what am I getting wrong about that? There is this kind of mythology that AI is just the hot this hot world in which there's a massive amount of demand, full primarily of investors who are a little bit gaga over AI. But presumably investors are getting a little smarter about all of this, more sophisticated in what kind of companies work, more inclined to buy revenue than future earnings, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering how that looks to you.
Look, I think it's possible for something to be overhyped and underhyped, and I think AI is definitely that. I think we are. If you looked at the internet changed everything, but the internet had its .com crash. There's a great video actually on YouTube from the British Broadcasting Corporation, and it's just post the .com crash. And obviously, the article is the TV reporting is very cynical. It's this internet thing. It was all a fad. All of these investors have lost all their money. But of course, being good, impartial journalists, they have to go to someone with a different opinion. So they go to this online bookseller called Jeff Bezos, who's convinced that the internet will come back and that his company is going to do okay. It's sort of obviously with the benefit of hindsight, it's reasonably amusing. So look, it is both the case that I have no doubt that billions and billions of dollars are being put into stuff that's not going to go anywhere. Nothing important has ever been built without irrational exuberance. And that a lot of this stuff will turn out to have been smoke and mirrors and utter nonsense. But the reason I think why some very smart investors are piling in nonetheless is you are building the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Netflixes of the generative AI world now. And there are the era-defining companies of the next 30 years are being built now on Gen AI as Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google were built on the internet.
That's a very painful story you bring up because, I don't know, 25 years ago or so, I was on a plane and it was a bumpy flight, and the guy next to me said, would you talk to me because I'm nervous? So I talked to him, and he said, oh, you've been so helpful. Come have dinner with me and my buddies. And we were flying in Seattle, so I went to have dinner with him and his buddies. And one guy on my left was the head of a big cell phone firm. He was already a billionaire. And some other guy was running a very big company, and my buddy owned a smaller company. But the guy to my right was sort of playing with his food and very quiet. And I was like ignoring him because he didn't seem that interesting. And so finally, out of humanity, I turned to him and I said, so what do you do? And he says, I have a small company. We're just developing. I was like, well, what are you developing? He said, well, we're going to sell books on the internet. And I thought to myself, this is just a terrible idea. That this will never, this will never work. One of the other guys at the table had a different point of view, and he gave him, I don't know, 10 or 20, I don't know, some number of millions of dollars. And of course, he now has $15 billion. The guy was Jeff Bezos. And I was exactly wrong. And I'm just begging my listeners, I can do a good interview. Don't turn to me for investment advice.
It's really easy to be right in hindsight, isn't it? It's much more difficult to be right in advance.
Yeah, much more difficult. But as I get to my concluding question here, that's exactly where I want to go. You know where you are. You know what's going on with generative AI. Where do you think in the next 5 years the frontiers are that people ought to be looking? Because developments, breakthroughs there are especially interesting to you.
Yeah, look, so I come from a really particular position on this, and all of our analysis, and we run a lot of benchmarks, we've got a lot of proprietary benchmarks, that the large language models are asymptoting and that they're converging. So it is my strong position that large language models in terms of the power of transformer models, are getting to as intelligent as they're going to get. We shouldn't expect to see the sort of leap we saw from, say, GPT-2 to GPT-3 or GPT-3 to GPT-4. Well, I don't think we're going to see those sorts of leaps through transformer technologies. So you either need a leap from a new idea in AI, and of course that's perfectly possible, but those things are very difficult to predict. I think what's much more likely is we now see the next 5 years, 10 years being the application of this technology. Electricity didn't get any cleverer from the late 19th century. Electricity didn't get any better, but we continue to find new ways of putting electricity to use in tools to do more and more interesting things that humans want to do. So I see that really with large language models, with anything that involves reading or writing. There are still vast swathes of human endeavour that haven't been touched by large language models, which will be. Really, that's about understanding workflows. It's about. Still, by the way, I think we've got like the user interface wrong for large language models. Again, this will seem very obvious backwards, but it's hard to think what it will look like. But people are still using like large language models as search engines, which is a terrible use case. So we are right at the start of this journey. I don't think the underlying tech gets any smarter, or not very much smarter, but I think the deploying that underlying tech in tool after tool after tool to do more and more human tasks is really what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years.
That is extremely helpful. This conversation has been extremely helpful. I am grateful to you for joining us, as I am sure are all of our listeners here at Siliconsciousness. Just the kind of conversation that's made us such a fast-growing podcast on AI. And so, Sean Williams, thank you very much. If you want to find out more about what Sean is up to, go and track AutogenAI, which is the company we have been discussing here. And who knows, with some luck, if I haven't put Sean off too much with my stories of lack of investment expertise, maybe we'll be able to invite you back at some point again in the future. But for now, thank you, Sean. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be doing more of this each and every week on here on Siliconsciousness, also on our podcast on AI, energy, and climate, and all the other DSR Network podcasts. So go follow us at thedsrnetwork.com. And if you like what you're hearing, by all means, click on membership and help support what we're doing. Until the next time, thank you very much. Thanks, Sean. Bye-bye.
Thanks, David.